In Victorian England, the Vicars Ripper was considered the Whitechapel perpetrator for many, many decades. It was thought that he was a surgeon, mentally unstable, and ended his life not long after the Mary Jane Kelly crime occurred. What is lesser known is a possible good motive that he had for these crimes. Well, let's put this to the pub test. G'day, I'm Owen, and trust me, this one will probably challenge a lot of what you have thought about Jack the Ripper in the past. Yes, we are discussing Montague John Druitt. Now, I have covered him previous on this channel, but this is just a quick video. This is the deep dive. Now, for many, many years, people who lived in Victorian England believed that Montague Druitt was Jack the Ripper, though they didn't know his name. And you'd ask, how could that be? Well, it was in 1891 that a newspaper article appeared, and the bloke who wrote it, his name was George Sims, and he was quite the big deal back in the day. So if he wrote something down, people tended to listen. And he described the perpetrator of the Whitechapel crimes as someone with medical knowledge, mentally unhinged, and soon took his life at the end of the crimes, as I mentioned in the introduction. But it did not name the name. Now, for many people familiar with Jack the Ripper, that will ring a bell. You'd think, well, that sounds exactly like the McNaghten memoranda that had been written just a little bit prior or around this time. But that wasn't written by George Sims. We see George Sims and Melville McNaghten did have a collaboration. They were well known to each other. Whether they were friendly, I'm not sure, but it is strongly suggested that Melville McNaghten wrote his memo to the police force but released the information to George Sims to publish. And so then it became generally accepted that that was the solution, and that Jack the Ripper had been identified, not necessarily caught, but he had been stopped, or stopped himself, depending on how you look at it. But people never made the connection to an actual person back then. So it was many decades later, in the 1920s and 30s, that people started scratching their heads, saying, well, if the police knew who this bloke was, well, why don't we know the name today? So they started diving into the description that George Sims gave. And they couldn't find one. There was no doctor that had been found drowned in the River Thames that would have matched the description in that newspaper article. So then people started suggesting this was just a bit of a wives' tale, bit of a myth, that just urban legend, perhaps, is the better term to use, that maybe Jack the Ripper wasn't caught. Perhaps the police had no clue whatsoever. So it was interesting that it was around 1959 that the McNaghten memoranda became public knowledge. Now, this is intriguing as regards that, because we are looking fairly solidly at this little memo that McNaghten wrote. If you are interested in Jack the Ripper fairly solidly, you've heard of this memo. You probably could remember that memo. But it's probably not the memo that was originally written that we have today. Because it was said that the granddaughter of Melville McNaghten, who had last name I think was Aberconway, released some of his private papers to a BBC documentary in 1959, and in it had the full version of the McNaghten memoranda, which is different to the one that we see today, which is a shortened version. Now, it's suggested, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but that McNaghten wrote this big memo explaining a lot more than what we see in the official version, and then when he presented that for release, he was told you need to cut it down. So then the official one eventually became known. But in that memo, he lists 3 suspects: Montague Druitt, a bloke with the last name Kosminski, and Michael Ostrog. But in his personal notes, in the Aberconway version of the memo, it says, "I'm inclined to exonerate the last 2, being Kosminski and Ostrog." So that basically said he was convinced that Montague Druitt was Jack the Ripper. And it was the exact description that George Sims gave. But in that very first video I did on Montague Druitt, I basically dismissed what McNaghten wrote because of one thing in that memo. But firstly, I'll go through what most people discredit McNaghten's memo on, and that's to start with that he was a surgeon or a doctor. Now, Montague Druitt wasn't. He ended up being a barrister. Yet, the way we use the terms today is way different to how they were used back then. So if you were studying to be a doctor, if you were doing any type of medical training, they'd call you a doctor. And then, so if you stopped, if you didn't complete, then they'd say, well, he used to be a doctor. They see if you get qualified, you're always a doctor. Well, the wording that is in the official memo, and that may not be the original wording that Melville McNaghten used, just pointing out, but regardless, it does fit Montague Druitt, because he would have had some medical training, as we're going to dive into. It said that he was middle-aged, and people say, well, he wasn't. When he passed away, he was around 30 years old. That's not middle-aged. But then you hear other people, even today, they will make the claim that, well, if you lived to 30 back then, you were doing well. And it was true. If you got to 60, well, that was quite the age back then. It's not so much today at all. But if the general life expectancy was around 60 years old, which was acceptable, well, then he sort of was middle-aged. So he probably got that one right. But also in that memo, he says that the family knew about it, that he definitely was Jack the Ripper. We will challenge that, or at least look into it in this video. And there is a lot to go through, so settle in and get yourself a beverage if you need one. But the thing that convinced me that Melville McNaghten had this totally wrong was the statement that they didn't release the name to the public to protect the family. Now, to me, I thought, well, who are the Druitts? They're not that, important. What harm would it have been to name this bloke who was just a small-time barrister? He was doing well for himself, but it just doesn't really make any sense. Until you look a little bit deeper, and what McNaghten said now carries an awful lot of weight. His father, William Druitt, had a considerable amount of cash and was doing well for himself in the professional world. But his uncle is the one that really takes centre stage here, and that's Robert Druitt. Now, you may not have ever heard of him, but the Druitt family and the doctors who became basically the founders of the Mayo Clinic. So the Mayo name is connected with the Druitt name if you go back. But it's not that Robert Druitt had anything to do with the Mayo Clinic at all. But there is a weird family connection with that. But Robert Druitt, well, he had written a book on surgery that was very, very well known back in his day. Now, he did pass away in 1883, and that is significant, as we're just about to touch on. But it is noted that every Druitt family had a copy of Robert Druitt's book on the shelf, and it was a detailed version of how to do surgical events. So just obvious connection there with Jack the Ripper, with people saying he must have had some surgical knowledge. or even as a young lad, Montague Druitt would have had access to this book. And so no doubt, because it's his uncle, and he got along with his uncle, he probably went through it. So he may have even just picked up knowledge on how to do certain things that Jack the Ripper did just from going through this book. But we move on. Robert Druitt also was very outspoken when it came to social issues. Now, he was very concerned with what was happening in some of these areas which were known as slums. Because he said, look, the sanitation is rubbish. And the communicable diseases that are cropping up because these women who are just out there selling themselves for money, it's disgusting. And look at what's happening. We're having all these preventable diseases just spreading rampantly. So we need to lock these women up. That will fix it. He was quite outspoken in that regard. Now, why the thought was maybe do something to the blokes to prevent that desire from spending the money on these women. But no, we won't do that. We'll just hound up all these women and lock them up. That was a very sensitive social issue. And it will come out again later. But Robert Druitt's main claim to fame was as an influencer. And that might shock some of you to think there were influencers in London in the 1880s, 1870s even. Well, absolutely. Now, if you don't understand how influencing works, people think it's a new phenomenon, but we've been influenced all of our lives through the media. It's just how it works. Like in Australia, Cadbury chocolate is the biggest chocolate brand in Australia. And what happens is if you don't see Cadbury ads on TV or YouTube or wherever you get your entertainment, well, then you'll see an article come out in the press saying chocolate will kill you. If you have any chocolate, it's going to send you to the hospital and cause all sorts of terminal illnesses. And then you'll see some Cadbury ads pop up on the TV, and all of a sudden then there's a media article saying, oh, a bit of chocolate, it's a miracle cure. Just even a block of chocolate a day is not going to hurt you. So the media companies influence Cadbury to spend some money on advertising. Now, hopefully I don't get sued for that, but I genuinely believe that happens all the time. But then influencing these companies realize, well, how else can we impact on people? And now with the younger generation, they realize that like all the other different quick social media hits, they need to get their products in front of them. And the old ways of doing it in the newspapers, on the TV is not going to work. So now they get these influencers to do it. Well, Robert Druitt, how would he become an influencer back then? Well, it's because alcohol was a huge issue. We just think of even like ones like William Berry, who is a very prominent Jack the Ripper suspect. He never beat up his wife on a Sunday because that's the day he wasn't drinking, because he was fairly religious and would go to church. So you imagine the amount of domestic violence that was happening because of alcohol during the 1800s, 1900s, even today. So there was a push back then to curb this drinking. Well, the alcohol companies couldn't have that. So how are you going to get some of these reputable people to go, well, it's okay to have a drink? Find a bloke who is a bit outspoken on social issues. Find a bloke who knows a bit about medicine. And then he would say, well, yeah, that's rubbish they're drinking in the slums, that cheap gin, that rubbish wine. Yeah, that'll kill you. I mean, look what it does to them. But if you get this good stuff, it's all right. In fact, it's got medicinal qualities. It will help you. And so Robert Druitt became famous as the influencer to convince people that drinking was okay. And no doubt there was a bit of remuneration involved. He wasn't doing it for the greater good. And it's interesting because even after 1883, after he'd passed away, he was still being used as the face of some new products, which sort of shows how convinced he was himself of the benefits of that, because he wasn't even around anymore to try the stuff. But the main point being made here is Robert Druitt was a household name because of, one, the Surgeon's Bible, two, his outspokenness on social issues, and 3, as the face of alcoholic beverages. So if his nephew was named as Jack the Ripper, that would have caused impact to his legacy. Yes, he's already passed away, but his legacy definitely would have been tarnished with that revelation. But there's one more connection as well. There was a person, I believe, and I don't know the correct pronunciation, but Vivian Magendie was a bigger deal than Robert Druitt. And Vivian Magendie was the bloke that was diffusing bombs in the 1800s, so from 1870s, 1880s. Now, remembering the Fenian Brotherhood were on a terror campaign of setting bombs all around London. So this bloke Magendie became quite the notable person, because initially he would be the ones diffusing them himself, but then he basically set up the first bomb disposal units. And so people thought he was really, really good. But the Druitts had married into the Magendie family. Specifically, a cousin of Montague Druitt was married to a niece of Vivian Magendie. That connection was known. So again, if Druitt's name had been thrown out as Jack the Ripper, it would have had serious consequences to some very influential people. So all of a sudden, McNaghten's comment, "We didn't name him for the sake of the family," now makes a lot more sense. I'm just taking a small diversion here. One of you out there put me onto a video about Montague Druitt. I already had this video planned, but I actually thought it was quite interesting. So I'll put a link in the description. If you have a spare 9 minutes, go and check out Cypher Vault and this video on Montague Druitt. It is a great video. Deserves a lot more views than it's got. It was less than 100 when I recorded this, but it's done very well. But I'm going to give a spoiler or two on that video. So go watch that, and I'll wait for you to come back before I give those spoilers. Well, welcome back, everybody. So if you did watch that video, you'll note that he mentions the confession letter of Montague Druitt, that author said, look, we've got it all tested and everything. The sad part about that is that it just doesn't exist, that anyone can find. That author who wrote that book said that his notes got stolen, so he couldn't present the evidence that he put in his book so much. And how much surgical study Montague Druitt did as well is also questionable. But still, if you watch that video, a lot of time and effort went into it, and I would say, as I say, definitely worth a look, because it gives you that bit of history on Montague Druitt as well. But moving on though, Montague Druitt did come from privilege, and he was considered like the golden child in his family. He was very athletic. He was awesome at sports, and when he was growing up, he was just absolutely knocking it out of the park academically. But when he got to higher education, he didn't go so well. Now, it's said that it's possible because he focused so much on his sporting endeavours that the books just sort of, dropped off. But then it's also suggested that he may have struggled to really focus. Like at that time, you'd have a lot of pressure on you to choose a path, choose a career, and that was your career for life. Hardly anybody would change back then, as we do now. Therefore, if you were not thrilled with a particular line of study you were doing, it would be really hard to engage properly. But when he decided to get into law, he approached his father and said, look, I need some spindooly to go and get my law degree. And his father said, look, buddy, we've invested a fair bit in you, and law, well, that's super, super expensive. And your track record suggests that this will just be a flash in the pan and you'll be off to something else. So I don't think we necessarily want to invest in that. And I certainly don't have the scratch to give you all this money now, and you're going to have your hand out later when the estate's divided up. And Montague Druitt, he backed himself. He said, well, look, I'll sign to say I get nothing from the will. So I will get the money now and set myself up. And he did. He became a barrister. But the concern with becoming a barrister back then, and why the family were worried, is that unlike today, if you're a barrister, well, you're probably living on your own private island somewhere. But back then, a lot of your clients had no money to start with. There wasn't really any legal aid. So you could just be setting yourself up for a bit of a life of poverty as well if you don't make the right connections. But Montague Druitt did do well for himself. And when he passed away, just in his early 30s, well, he left a significant amount of money behind. So it did work out for him, this change to his law career. But when he was at school, there's some things that describe him that some people say means that he was Jack the Ripper. First, that he was a fierce, fast bowler in cricket. Now, if you know cricket, you go, well, that's sort of a bit of a compliment, because you're a bit quick, maybe a bit of intimidation to the batsmen. They got to duck and weave a bit, particularly when there's no protection back then, no helmets, and you may have just had some pads on your legs and that's it. Well, if that's the case, then we need to lock up the Australian fast bowling cartel of Mitchell Starc, Pat Cummins and Josh Hazlewood. And while we're at it, we need to lock up Jimmy Anderson and Stuart Broad. Not because they're fierce fast bowlers, those blokes just should be locked up. That's a joke, by the way, for people that don't understand my humour. Like the Ashes are coming up, so, all you English fans out there, we can have a bit of fun with it. But no, Stuart Broad, Jimmy Anderson, top blokes, I'm sure. I certainly wouldn't want to face them. But the other thing they say and point to is that in his debating when he was at school, they said that he had intolerant and aggressive speech. That's also a sign of Jack the Ripper. Well, I don't know. Now, if I'm getting a barrister, hopefully I never need a barrister, but if I need a barrister, I probably want someone that's going to be giving intolerant and aggressive speech if they're defending me. That's sort of the job description, really, isn't it? So I can see why he went into law if he was known like that in the debating team. So again, I sort of don't see that in itself pointing to him as being this perpetrator. But they say that there was a bit of mental health problems in the family. And yes, his mother did suffer from mental health. He passed away before her, though. But they say he suffered from this like epileptic mania, I think they call it, where you'd sort of, for want of a better term, have an out-of-body experience where you would go and do these horrendous things. And then you'd sort of remember you did them, but you didn't really connect them with you. And so he'd have these lucid moments and then these mad moments until it all came crashing down on him when after the Mary Kelly crime. And it's also said that he was the original English Patient. And I've never seen The English Patient, the movie, but they say that the family took him over to France because they realised he was perpetrating these crimes and he needed some psychological help. And while he's over in France, because they thought they could do this on the side, on the discreet level, he's raving about how he's Jack the Ripper. But there was an English-speaking nurse there who then reported it, and then they had to ship him out of France, and then not long after that, he ends up in the Thames. We will get back to that. But that was reported in a newspaper that this event happened with Montague Druitt. We'll see if that passes the pub test. But then people point to the event that happened at Mitre Square, and specifically Joseph Lawender. And they say that Lawender saw Montague Druitt. That when he was giving his description, he described a fair-complexioned person with a mustache, and they say all that evidence points to the fact that he saw Montague Druitt. And further to that, when other attacks happened, once with James Sadler, it said that they brought Lawender in to see if that was the same bloke he saw at Mitre Square, and then another bloke, and this is not his full name, I haven't touched on him, a video is coming about him though, but like William Grant, and they said that Lawender actually identified that bloke as the person he saw in Mitre Square. Now, what is intriguing about all of that evidence is what Lawender himself said. When Joseph Lawender gave evidence, he said, "I saw the person, I saw the height, but I don't think I would ever recognise them again." So then why would the police drag him back to try and identify people a couple of years after the event? That doesn't make any sense at all and would not pass the pub test, except if we consider it from this way. It is of note that at the inquest, they made sure that Lawender did not give a description of what he saw. The police made it evident that he couldn't identify the Ripper. But if they knew that he saw who they believed was the perpetrator, and they also knew that he would be able to identify them again, they needed to protect him. They needed to let it known that this guy has no idea at all. And then when they catch the bloke, bring him in and he can say, yep, he is Jack the Ripper. That would pass the pub test, and it is a possibility. But then why would the police, knowing that Montague Druitt has already passed away in the Thames, would they bring Lawender back to identify other people? There is a possibility, which there's a lot we're heading to here, and you're going to have to stay with me. But firstly, some of the evidence that points to the fact it could be Montague Druitt is not because of the eyewitness testimony. Now, graduates of the Oxford University started up a bit of a charity to help out people in the slums. And that's what these areas around Whitechapel were known as. So they would approach these graduates and say, have you got time and maybe the resources to come and help these people? So doctors, lawyers, all sorts of professions would give of their own free time in charitable works to help these ones. But the socialist movement was starting to get a bit of traction as well. And they're seeing, look, this problem is way beyond the scope of just doing a bit of charity for one or two people. A lot more work needs to happen here. Remembering this was not a welfare state back in those days. You were totally on your own. If you weren't making money, well, the only welfare you could get is go to the workhouse, which was effectively a prison. The conditions were terrible, and they had a common grave just nearby. So once you fell off the perch, you'd be in that. So there wasn't any help really from the government. In fact, they say the workhouses were designed to make it absolutely intolerable to live so that you would move out, that you wouldn't stay there at all. And here is an intriguing detail. But Whitechapel, and I apologise if you're living in Whitechapel at the moment, though many people in Whitechapel probably don't mind because there's quite the tourist industry based around these 5 crimes, but it was known at the time as the Evil Quarter Mile. And interestingly, every single Jack the Ripper, the 5 canonical crimes, were committed inside this area that was considered the worst of the worst slum in England. To the point that people, property owners, would go slumming. It's where the term comes from. They would dress up in their nice dinner suits and then go down and have a look around to see how the other half lived. It was a spectacle because there was no sanitation. Well, very little sanitation, I should say. There was diseases. People were just out on the streets. You'd find these unfortunates. And I don't know why that was a tourist attraction, but it was. But then the socialist movement said, we have to fix this. And stepping back a little bit before we go into the 5 canonical crimes that happened and why they may have been done, we need to go and look at 2 crimes just prior to this. Knowing that the spotlight was on this Evil Quarter Mile, when Emma Smith was attacked on the street and she says at least by 2, maybe 3, could have been more blokes, attacked her, viciously assaulted her in ways I am not going to go into in this video. Well, that made news. She managed to get home. She didn't even want to go to the hospital, but her friend said, no, you're going, and she did pass away that night. That crime was deplorable. And then the attack on Martha Tabram. She was found basically tucked away in a remote area, but, well, in the evil quarter mile, but not on the street. But it would look like she was attacked by more than one person, considering different knives were used. There was some marks similar to what Jack the Ripper would do, but then there was many stab marks on her, which looked like it came from, left-handed and right-handed people and so forth. And these types of crimes were happening to other people, absolutely. But these two particularly were used to say, hey, look, you think these women don't mean anything. They don't rate. Because look at their lifestyle. Look at what they're doing. They're just selling themselves on the street. So they were less than human in people's eyes. But these activists were saying, what got them to that situation? Like, we call them unfortunates. Well, it is unfortunate that they were probably in bad relationships where they were getting beat. And the better option they had was to go out on the street and sell themselves to make money. And when we consider the 5 canonical victims particularly, as well as Martha Tabram there and Emma Smith, they weren't full-time unfortunates. They weren't selling themselves all the time. If they had enough money, they weren't out on the street every night. If they were in a situation like Mary Kelly was when she was with Joe Barnett and he was making money, well, she wasn't on the street. So it wasn't a life of choice that they faced. It was a life of necessity. And when people started understanding, well, hang on, yeah, this probably isn't good. We need to do something about it. So here is a possible motive for Jack the Ripper. And before you hit the keyboards and say, Owen, you've totally lost your marbles this time, just hear the whole thing out. So, because the press were now shining a light on Whitechapel, why not make more of a statement? You've seen what those 2 crimes have done by drawing attention to the plight of these poor people. So just consider, you now want to really make a difference in these people's lives. You've seen what the 2 crimes prior of Emma Smith and Martha Tabram have done. So you decide, well, I know how to turn up the heat here. So going into Bucks Row, you find Polly Nichols. You start doing your crime. And you want to make a statement. You want to make this look absolutely terrible because that will get media press. But 2 people disturb you. So you have to disappear into the night. You don't live in the area, so you disappear, but then you come back the week later, knowing you've got to change it up a little bit now. And so then with Annie Chapman in Hanbury Street, you won't stay on the street, but you'll be in a backyard. There's many people live in this area, and you can then make this crime look worse because you've got the time. It will soon be seen, and it will make people pay attention. Not long after that, you decide to make things even worse, do a worse crime. So in Dupfield's Yard, you're there with Elizabeth Stride, but you don't quite factor in that there's lots of people coming and going there, so you have to leave. You still complete that task, but then you realise I could make this an absolute spectacle. And you run in to Catherine Eddowes, and you run into Catherine Eddowes near Mitre Square, and that's the perfect location for you. And you perform the worst atrocity you've done so far. That gets lots of media press. People are now in hysteria, and they are looking at the conditions of these people. But that soon starts dying away. There's only one way you could make a statement. Because the people you're trying to reach, the people you are trying to really get to pay attention are the property owners. And these women, they just live night to night. They could be in any room, in any place. So now you need to find a victim in their own place, in their own property. Well, not a property owner, but Mary Kelly did have a place of residence. So then you make sure that this crime scene will make worldwide news. And then all these people that you've been trying to reach, trying to get them to see how bad these conditions are, will have to stand up and take notice, will actually have to take action. Now you're going to say, Owen, that is absolutely ridiculous. That just wouldn't happen. Well, as sad as this is, whether Jack the Ripper meant that to happen or not, it worked. In fact, George Bernard Shaw, now he did a satire on this, and if you don't understand satire, I will explain it after I read what he said. Now, I won't do word for word, but he basically wrote an article and said, we have wasted our time by doing these pamphlets, like trying to do some activism, when some independent genius has changed the perspective of all these property owners by offing a few dregs. They are his words. That is a direct quote. And then he continued further by saying, if he chose to start taking out a duchess, as in murdering a duchess, well, then maybe we'd get socialism in England. Now, that was satire. He was making grandiose statements in a very dark, comedic way, but it also proves a point. So what he was saying is, look, we've been trying to fix this. Some bloke has come along and killed a few people, and now we're going to get change. He was an independent genius. Whether he meant to or not, it did work. And that is truly, truly sad. But you would say, but Owen, nobody would do anything like that just to make social change. Why would you harm people to affect good? Happens all the time. Was happening in England back then. The Fenian Brotherhood were blowing people up. People they didn't know, totally innocent people, but they were trying to effect change for the good for themselves. And it has happened in history, and I'm not going into conspiracy theories here, but some governments themselves or leaders have perpetrated crimes against their own people to get their people on board with them because they're blaming the other side. They say, oh, look what these people have done. And then that gets people really riled up and they go and support this government and then probably go off to war or whatever it is. And it probably still happens today. I mean, history does repeat. But the question then is, could Montague Druitt have been that person? But then in 1898, what became known as the Vicars' Ripper appeared in the paper. Now, the story was that a vicar, a priest or however that works out to be, sent in a message to a paper saying, look, I can solve the Jack the Ripper crimes. When he explained it, it was known as the White Church Mystery. But he said he got this from a fellow brother, another vicar, whose cousin had confessed to him and said, in 10 years' time, you have to let people know that the Jack the Ripper crimes have been solved, that the perpetrator is no longer around, and so that no one else can get convicted for them. And that apparently was the motive for coming out and doing so. So when the whole story was laid out in the paper, it really sounds exactly the same as McNaghten's description, as Sims's description of the perpetrator. But how do we know that it was talking about Montague Druitt? And how do we know it was even talking about Jack the Ripper? Because it said White Church Mystery. But church and chapel are very close. But it said that Montague Druitt's cousin, whom in this case he's supposed to have confessed to, was the vicar at the time of Whitechurch, which is interesting. But this other vicar, the one who released it to the paper, said, well, look, we tried to make sure that it wasn't evident so that the family still couldn't be identified. So they were trying to let it be known on one hand, but still trying to keep it secret in the other. But this Vicars' Ripper got absolutely ripped apart in the papers, let me say, because they were saying this is just nonsense, he's talking rubbish, blah, blah, blah. Yet it still matched so close to what McNaghten was saying, which is intriguing. But there is another slight interesting thing here. It said that McNaghten had a bit of a connection with the Druitt family. But it's also been suggested and apparently reported that McNaghten wanted to name Montague Druitt. He just wanted to get it out there to say, look, it's been dealt with. Doesn't really matter about the family's reputation at all, because he figured, well, it wouldn't have mattered. Everyone knew Montague Druitt had some mental health issues, so what would be the big issue? But it's said that Montague Druitt's brother threatened to expose every gay person in the church, in the government, in the police force, everywhere. Now, you might remember from the McNaghten memoranda, that was one other little detail he gave about Montague Druitt, that he was, by his term, sexually insane, which back in those days could very well refer to someone who was gay. And it was suggested that perhaps Montague Druitt was. Therefore, considering that they were a bit of a prominent family, he probably did know all those in those social settings who were that way inclined. And back then it was illegal, and it would have ruined lots of people's lives. And that's why that name was buried for an awful long time. So does this pass the pub test? Could Montague Druitt have been Jack the Ripper? Well, I have to say, considering all the evidence, he has to stay on the list. There is some intriguing stuff here. He ticks a lot of the boxes, though some of the evidence people use to pin him, as I've mentioned here, is a little bit dubious. But the one thing that really raises a question mark in my mind, but could also be explained away, is how Montague Druitt ended his life by putting rocks in his pocket and jumping into the River Thames. Now, as we mentioned here, he definitely was an athlete. So he could have swam his way out. So maybe that's why you'd put rocks in your pocket to make sure that you're, sunk down. But that wouldn't make any sense. Because if you were doing this, and the only real motive he could have had is this social reform, it was working. It very well could have done the job. So wouldn't you start thinking, well, I've sacrificed 5 people, literally, but look, I can now make a difference, so it'll be all worthwhile. Why, when you saw it was doing something, would you not want to see it through? So to me, that just doesn't make sense at all. So then the other theory, that he was totally mad and just had lucid moments, just also doesn't pass the pub test for me. I just can't see that he could have just jumped in and out of these psychotic moments and then gone on and had some big victories in civil courts as a barrister. Now, I could be wrong. I'm no expert, but I just don't see how you could just switch on and off like that and perpetrate these crimes and then, in an odd moment, go and jump in the River Thames. But there is another option which perhaps would explain it. But what if he was targeted? 1, he could have been targeted by the police. Maybe they knew that he was the Ripper and they knew that they couldn't get a conviction. So they decided to do their own bit of justice. Knowing that had they convicted him, he definitely would have gone to the gallows. Or why not just do that themselves? It is a possibility. I'm not saying it happened, but that would make sense. The other option is that someone else did these crimes, but they needed someone to take the fall because the police were closing in on them. And so they threw Montague Druitt's name under the bus and also made sure that he couldn't defend himself. That is also a strong possibility as well. And that would also make sense as to why the family then went absolutely ballistic to make sure that his name did not come out. And it didn't come out for a good 60, 70 years after the events. But as I say, all in all for me, in these deep dives, I have to make a call and he has to stay on the list. But he is not the only one that will still be left on this list. We will be eliminating a few, but I still think this one needs further investigation. But There was a lot to take in here, and absolutely let me know what you think. The motive for doing these crimes is quite an intriguing one, and it's not my doing. I've seen this put forth in a few spots, but it doesn't seem to get a lot of attention. And you might say, well, there's a good reason why, Owen, people don't talk about this. But to me, well, it's quite intriguing. And it does actually open up some other possibilities too. But as always, thank you so much for watching. It genuinely is appreciated. Make sure that you hit that like button, hit the subscribe as well so you see all of these videos. Thank you to all who are sharing these videos wherever you are. I'm Owen, you've been watching the Pub Test, and we will see you on the next one.